We are live. We are on. All right. So I'm going to try to cover as much as I can within a 45-minute window or however long. We're going over directives today. By raise of hands, who actually has worked with directives? All right, and who's actually done like pretty advanced stuff? Not pretty advanced, but like transclusion and. Okay, so that's what we're not going to get to. So you're. So what we're going to cover for this first section, I split up into 4 sections, and the need for directives. What are directives and when to use directives? And the next section we'll then talk about the directive definition object, or the DDO, as they call it. And that's, in a nutshell, it's just what gets passed to you when you use your directive. It kind of encapsulates all your logic and your options that you get. And that's the returning function, the template URL, the strict option scope, and dollar sign scope loader. When we can compile, we'll make a brief summary because I can talk about it and probably confuse everybody, including myself. And controller, which is optional to use. I really don't ever use it before. I just use the one function. Every time that I can do it. There are some cases where it's going to use a controller if you want to encapsulate even further out and just use the parent script, which we'll go into. The next thing we'll talk about Angular events, watch, broadcast, emit, on. Now, I'll get deep into the watch, but the broadcast, emit, on. I'll go slightly over that just because we don't have time. They're really not that hard to understand. More of just, it would be easier for you to try an example with it than for me just talking about it. And the advanced topics like compiler, transclusion, and the Iceflip scope in depth. We'll go over a little bit of Iceflip scope. I'm not going to go too terribly in depth with it. You'll see an example with the demo that I have. So let's start off. So the need for directives. Why do we need directives? The main thing why I think we need directives is reusability. Reusability allows you to isolate and encapsulate a whole piece of your DOM and then use it willy-nilly. Like, I'll just plug this in here, I'll just plug this in here, I'll just plug this in here. And you can use the same code for the same thing and you're just doing over and over again. Another good use case for directives is, say that you have a huge piece of jQuery code that's just so confounded and usually turns out to be spaghetti code. I don't know if you've ever dealt with jQuery. But if you start adding events to listeners on with jQuery, it can get really confusing. So it kind of isolates and keeps everything in one container rather than have like an event that has 12 listeners on it, and you don't know where the listener is happening, and it kind of keeps everything organized. And that's another use case. So what are directives? Directives are, do they fill movies? No. Do they direct traffic? And somewhat, if you're using routing, but not the case. Do they have something to do with the nonstop flow? No. What else I should not have too far. Directives are awesome. I really like working with directives. They had a lot of simplicity, yet had a lot of they take the complexity out of me, I think, in some parts, because you're not worrying about the whole DOM, you're worrying about just a piece of the DOM. Posting is a lot better. And you also need your mobile lives. Also, logic and behavior is also entangled in these directives. We have a linking function or a controller that we might pass into a directive definition object that will encase all the logic just for that single piece of functionality or a single element that you have of your directive. And it's a way to teach HTML new tricks. So when I say that, I say like it's a way to add your own tag, or it's a way to add your own elements or attributes, so you can actually create your own little element that does funny things when you click a button or something like that. And it's anything in the app that touches the DOM. And we want to make sure that we always keep anything that touches the DOM in an Angular directive. I'll go over and I'll probably emphasize this so much more. It's not for where you just keep your jQuery. The only other Angular construct that actually does any kind of directed and date binding is the Angular expression, which is the double curly brackets. These are the only other things that touch the DOM. So, and we want to keep it that way. It's like an order of magnitude more just to use jQuery than to use a compiled piece of HTML that Angular compiles. And everything that manipulates the DOM, like I was saying, is it should be in a directive. And just for example, ngView is actually a model-driven directive, which is just something that just gets injected into your layout index HTML or whatnot. It actually is a directive that does just what we're saying here. And structurally speaking, a directive is just a function that is attached to an element. So like if I have an element called like button click, and then I have this linking function that says what to do when this element has an event called on it, whether a button is clicked or a button is hovered over or something like that. It's just something to bind events to the DOM. But I say structurally speaking, just because when you get into depth, it's actually even more than that. It's actually an execution environment. We actually have this DDO that has its own little scope, and you've got this really little mini application that you can just kind of feed it into things. And like I was saying, it keeps composability or composition at its finest. And you can think of them as little tiny robots that live in your DOM elements and that like direct them what to do and kind of actually pilot them to what they're supposed to do. Just like Wally. Now even more. Directives can bring their own DOM and BYOD. And it's funny, I have a picture here. That's your own DOM. Bring your own DOM. Not bring a 5-pack of some kind of beverage. So what directives aren't? They're not just where jQuery goes. What? They're not just where jQuery goes, and they're not just where jQuery goes. A lot of people like to wrap up their jQuery functionality inside a directive. Now, if you really have to do that, put it in a directive, but try to use jQuery Lite, which we'll go over. And that's just like I was saying before, you don't want to have Angular and jQuery fighting against each other, because I've seen sometimes where there'll be a race condition to say, or actually not a race condition, but it would be like a compile condition where Angular will try to compile the code, and then jQuery will go ahead and run, it'll kick off an event, jQuery will go and run, change the DOM, and then now the Angular's got to go and compile that code again, and then jQuery sees this event, and you get the cyclical errors, or not cyclical event that keeps on happening, and you can really kind of get confused. The kind of bugs that you just don't like to debug. It's like, where do I start? And so the directive definition object, the DDO, you can find that it's called a DDO like deep in the document, not deep in the documentation, but if you look for the Angular documentation, you go into the $ compile, you find this directive definition object. And who's heard of a directive called the DDO? Yeah. No, it's so the directive definition object is just their way of saying that here is how my directive is defined, and here's how I want it to act, and it's all encapsulated in this one object, and do whatever you want with it. And so what's in this definition object, and those who have actually used directives, it's just the returning object. It's nothing more, and we'll see an example here shortly. But it's the things that are in here is the return function, which is the linking function, the template, and template URLs. We'll go over all these. So starting with naming your directive. So HTML is insensitive, and for some reason Angular doesn't like it when you add like camel paste to this HTML right here. So say this is my directive, sample directive. It's an element, and it's going to call as my data definition object to inject whatever my directive. And the way that you declare it in Angular, so this is HTML and this is Angular, it just gets overwritten as camel views. So expect Angular just to do this automatically. There's no way around it. When I first started doing directives, I was like, why is this thing, why can't I just name it what I want to name it? Don't fight with it, yeah. Just let it be. So the creation of one is pretty simple. It's just a directive off your Angular module. I'm guessing you guys have made modules in Angular. Yeah. Okay. So off this is an extension really. It's a literal object. You have an Angular module, and then you attach a directive to it. The example would be like this. So my Angular module, my module name, and then just list my dependencies. And then off of that, just say, all right, well, I want a directive using those dependencies. Now there's kind of semantics, which I like to do, and that's to create an Angular module, and then just have a semicolon here, put it into a variable, probably confusing you, and then just say module.directive. It's all up to how you like to do your directives. I feel it's more composed better, just because you have one variable on top, and then you still run that variable. And the factory will return either a function or an object containing a function, which we'll see the linking function is what's just attached to this factory function, which is listed right here. So this gets passed back. So this is what you call it. This is what gets passed back, and that's just your DDO. That's all it is. jQuery let. Angular will use jQuery if you have it listed before your dependencies within your index HTML. You know, like you have like scripts. If your Angular script is above your jQuery, it will actually use JQLite. If it's below it, then it will start using jQuery. And that's mainly because it allows you to use jQuery. It's not that it's frowned upon to use it, I guess, if you want to say that. But it's just for the reasons like I was saying before, is that you really want to keep jQuery out of your Angular code. And it's limited just to the directive scope of the DOM. So so jQuery we're going to use it. So here's your linking function. This is what gets returned. Like I was saying, this function right here is our factory function. And that just returns an object. Really simple. And within that object is your DDO, or what your DDO is called. Now to use jQuery, as you can see, we got a binding, a jQuery bind on here, and we're binding our mouse into it. Now, everything gets packaged up with this element attribute. It's what your directive's named. Like we were saying before, how we could name our directive. I think it was our sample directive. Remember in our HTML we had that sample dash directive. That element actually gets passed into here, and we can bind on it. So we can take our directive and say, hey, within our directive, let's bind to this mouse enter function. And, people that don't know the mouse enter, it's just when you take your mouse and go over something, and it within, like, say you have a button, and you take your mouse and you go into the realm of that button. It's just that's mouse enter, and there's also mouse E. It's just it's like sort of like a mouse over, the mouse off, or actually the other one, the mouse over, and something else. And this is actually just listed the jQuery part of what it would look like in jQuery, which is like you find the selector, and then you bind to it, and then you give it what to bind to, and then you return what you want to do with when you want to bind to it. But this is over your whole DOM. So another good point here is that when you're using jQuery, you're not just stuck in your little directive. You're actually doing a whole full DOM scan, finding that selector, and then binding to it. So it's another reason why you should stick with jQuery. If Angular element / jQuery doesn't do what you want it to do, try harder. You can pretty much do 99% of the stuff with jQuery. It just takes a little more, I guess, oomph. or more effort. But if you actually stick to it, it will pay off. And your Angular code will be more composed and more absolute. So the next thing, template URLs. Now these are just what you want injected when your directive is called. So say I have a directive call, button click again, and I have a template. I think I got a, yeah. So this template's right here. I have a div on this template. Now that will be inserted into wherever my template's defined, or wherever my directive is defined. So you can do it in two ways. You can do it in template where you just kind of list your HTML, which is okay for doing small things. But when you actually do like files that are actually more complex HTML, you want to put that to a template URL and try and keep that out of your directive, because I don't know, adding a huge long string of HTML can be kind of cumbersome. So put that in a file and let it be as HTML rather than just as a big string. Yeah, that's another thing. So, to tell you the truth, I've never actually had both, but I think the template overrides the template URL. I mean, we were talking when I was doing the run through, and I was like, yeah, I don't know which one overrides which. But that's a good thing. It'll know you have your template. You have to find one template for one directive, so you can, yeah, you can use separate directives. But he's saying that what if you list both the template, and there's two ways to do it. If you list both the template and the template URL in the same directive, I don't know. I think the template will provide whatever you have in the template. Don't know. I'm guessing on that, but if I had to take a wild guess, it will file as guess. That's what I'm saying. But I'm going to try it after this. District. So district is where you want in your HTML, where you want your direction to be located. There are 4 of them. In this case, we're using E for element. It's basically so that sample directive that we had before, a simple dash directive, was actually bound on an element. And when you bind it on an element, whatever you bind on that element will actually be certain this template URL. So we'll go over that in a little bit when we get to the demo, which I hopefully will clarify this, because this is a lot of information. Restrict continue. So are reusable. And the way that they're reusable is that we have this restrict attribute that tells where we can use them. So say you have like 16 elements, and those 16 elements are the same directive. You can actually just pop in each one of those directives and build in their own encapsulated environment. And we'll talk about Iceflip scope, because when you start having all these directives, their scopes can start to get really messy really quick. What's that? So the controllers are for scopes, but they take $sign scope, and we'll go over that. So there's a difference between $sign scope and non-$sign scope. So we can restrict to usage to a specific context, and that's basically what I was saying, is that if you have 16 elements, every one of those elements has its own context, and that's basically what it is designed for. So here are the 4 elements. Attribute, which is an attribute on a div or something like that. You can name it whatever you want. So a simple directive would have simple directive equals, and then whatever you you can actually just leave an attribute blank and still pick it up. Class, so you can have like a CSS class name and directive, and comment, which is going to be deprecated or is deprecated. It's just for backwards compatibility. That's how they had it before. Is that you can have like this comment, which is //, and then or not // the angle bracket, exclamation point, // or /#, and then it would find that, and then all of a sudden it would inject template in there, and that seems to be very, I don't know why they took it out, but that's what they're taking out. It just makes sense. I mean, like, why would you want to insert a directive on a comment? And then you can stack these. You can actually have an element, an attribute, and a class, all of them listed on the same element if you want. But I would prefer I mean, I would recommend just putting only one. If you're going to use it, only use one-on-one element. So like, or one-on-one tag. So like, you wouldn't have a simple directive element, and then have a simple directive attribute, and then have a simple directive class, and then have a simple directive comment, all within this one piece of HTML. It's usually they have their use cases. So scope versus $sign scope. So scope is assignable. It's actually a service that Angular provides by the, I think it's next one. Yeah, it's just shorthand for the scope provider. And it's an Angular provider actually. So that gives the scope for your controller or stuff like that. It just assigns a scope to whatever you're working on, whatever your encapsulated stuff is outside of the directive. And you can use it, like you were saying, you can assign your own controller, and then $sign scope gets passed to that actually is provided by Angular. But you don't really want to do that. You kind of want to keep your scope context to your directive unless you're talking to other directives, which is advanced topic. I won't get into talk about that. But it's really cool when you combine scopes and you have a parent scope that both two directives can talk to, and so you kind of just bind to that scope and the other directive binds to that scope, and then they can communicate with each other because they're just binding on the same scope, so they can have the same property that changes in one directive and also the other. But that's all kind of scope in that. Because like scope is its own topic. And then just regular scope, it's just customizable reference to its own local context. So when you have a directive, this is what gets passed in, and this is what is only available to you within your directive. And we'll go over that too. Link and compile briefly, like I was going to say. So this got cut off. I noticed that on the way, but I didn't have time to change it. So this is like what HTML, the compilation life cycle is. So Angular compiles your HTML. I don't know if you guys know this, but it compiles it and then assigns each linking function its own. It actually creates either a JavaScript file under the hood or something like that, and then it actually references those link functions when you use your directive. And that's what makes it so speedy, and that's also the reason why you don't put jQuery. You don't want to use jQuery to mess with your HTML because it's going to compile. So just real quick, like we were talking about, this for restrict things, that actually takes those. And I don't know if who's familiar with Java dependency injection. So in a nutshell, Java, it works similar to Java dependency injection where you have your annotations and there's a registry for your injection or your dependency you can inject. This does the same thing. It actually registers your directives and then it compares them against the list of registered directives. So if your directive is not registered within that registration, it'll throw an error. And then it calls the compile function, which returns the linking function. So the linking function. Am I losing everybody? Everybody's good? Well, I'm hoping that the demo will clear some things up. We'll call this linking function, and then it collects all the linking functions within your DOM. So you have this whole set of functions that's in one file now, and then once it has all these event listers on it. So you have so your linking functions are linked to an event handler. And then once you want to use it, it then calls the event, emits the event onto those onto this huge collection of linking functions, and then it just kicks off whatever your linking function is. Directive. And I think I just lost myself there. But once it's compiled, AngularJS creates the scope. It doesn't create anywhere before this, so you have all these linking functions, and then it actually creates scope for your directive, scope for your parents, and all this stuff like that. All these traverses of the tree creating scopes, and then it's traverses the DOM to compile the browser. And then if something happens here, like I want to compile something on the blog, then we'll go through this whole thing. We'll have jQuery steps, and then we'll do this whole thing over again. It's also known as the digest lifecycle. So compile really quick. These are two things. So directive either returns a linking function or a compile function. Now, compile you will almost never need to use. And that's only because that when you want to compile something, you want to take that little snippet of HTML within your template and add something to it, and then compile it again so it actually renders to the browser again as HTML. So it takes your directed HTML and say like, a lot of these things use like ng repeat because it's always being repeated, so it always has to create new models and create new things. So ng repeat will keep on creating these new directives, whereas any other that are in the list or ng repeat, just use ng repeat. Yeah, it's just a list that they make, and it just repeats through creating this little section of HTML to acknowledge for each thing within the list. No, see, like a sort of. So the sort is actually a filter. Sort uses bar, the ng filter that we were using earlier today. No, yeah. So this is after the fact. This is so like an ng repeat will go ahead and create all these things, and then a sort. Actually, a sort might do the list before it does the ng repeat, so that when it creates every one of those things in ng repeat, it will be in order as they're coming through off the array or off the collection. ng view is actually another good example. It's something that gets rendered like when you use routing or something like that. Whenever you're inserting this ng view in there, you need to compile that whole thing over again. So maybe I'm assuming too much. Can I get a hand raise for how many people have used the router? The ng router. All right. Yeah. So ng router is just a way to say, all right, when this URL is hit, just go ahead and insert this HTML, and that's what's being compiled. It's actually being compiled at runtime when you say I need this, and then it goes ahead and renders that whole thing. Linking function is basically where everything else goes. It just creates listeners on the directive and holds all the logic that you need for your directive. And there's 3 standard parameters going to the linking function, which you'll see here in a second, plus a 4th controller. Now these things are actually supplied by the directive function, and they are scope element and attributes. These things are not they're not like providers, so they have to be in the specific order as they're put in. So like, for example, if you have a scope and then an element and then attributes, I'm getting at it. So let's go over it. This is so here's a little something talking about Iceflip scope. It's basically taking a scope and isolating it to just your context for your directive. Who's here to use Iceflip scope? Probably a little bit, yeah. So it's a little bit, and it's only really needed if you need to really contain your directive into a single piece of scope, rather than this whole the parent of the directive. So it's like its own little scope that you can just kind of feed things into off of the directive. So, oh gosh, I thought I was going to tell you. By default, operator alone, and I'll just go through these. The app binds, since not all you guys know about Iceflip scope. The main one you'll probably use is this at sign, and that just binds an attribute that's on the directive HTML to your Iceflip scope. These things only apply to Iceflip scope, and the other two, yeah, you'll use them. I mean, the equal sign binds the attribute to your parent scope. But like I said, that stuff's definitely a little advanced. So hopefully with live demos, this goes all smoothly. Yeah. Huh? Oh yeah, I'll go over that. So here's this little enter button. Now this enter button is just a simple directive that we have. I've got a mouse here. Yeah. Oh, come on. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yeah. I think we had an issue with this last time. That's weird. All right. I know there's a presentation. Maybe this will help. All right, so we're going to have to go presentation view to not presentation view. So let me explain this. So here we have the element directive right here, and it's just as an attribute. This is what I was saying about the restrict. Actually, you can restrict on elements, attributes, classes, and comments. But we're using an attribute here. Let's just kick this off. See, it's going to suck. How do I get out of this? There we go. Full screen. Where are we? All right. So here's our little enter button directive. As you can see, it's just simple. It's just a little button that doesn't really do much right now. But as you can see from this right here, all we're doing is just assigning it this singular expression. But let's get down to the directive. Now, if I can only find out how to open that file. How do I get out of presentation? And shut it off. So here's the actual directive. Here's this link function I was talking about, and how you can see that there. Gosh dang it.
By the way, this is all being streamed and recorded on YouTube, so if you want to go back and review it, you can see details.
So here's the attributes. Yeah. Oh, I thought you were saying something. So the scope, element, and attributes, these have to be actually in this correct order. You can name them whatever you want, but when they get passed in from your element, when it gets compiled, this is what it expects. It expects the first attribute to be scope, or the first argument to be scope, the second argument to be the element, and the third argument to be the attributes. And what actually that is that this is the scope that's bound local to this directive. To this DDO, which is basically from here to all the way down. This is all, I just got notes in here. Wherever the directive stops, so like right here, that's your DDO, and that's what gets returned back. And you can see that my directive is just called enter button with the camel case, like I was saying before too. Control Shift F. Is that what it was? Get out of full screen. Oh, that's annoying. So here we'll just do a simple jQuery Lite handler to begin with, which is doing the mouse enter, which is just the, like I was saying before, it's whenever the mouse enters the button. We can see that. We can see that. Red now. Red now. That's restricted. You're wondering probably why this thing doesn't turn enough red and have down the mouse leave. So when we enter, it'll never turn back because we don't have the leave yet. So we'll just comment in. Gosh, there's got to be a way I can zoom in here. That's really. Usually you just zoom by just doing a scrolling. Oh, I probably just messed up my development machine. But, alright, I guess we're just going to have to bear going back and forth. So, as you can see right here, is that I've done the mouse enter, that turned the button red. It's just a danger. We're going to need a danger attribute on danger class onto that button when we hover over it. And if we do this, this will do the same thing. It's just when we go off of it, it will do the back to what it was before. And just so I don't have to keep on going back and forth. Oh yeah. Ah, here we go. Yeah, that'll work. So now we hover over and hover over. So that's a pretty simple directive for doing that little. For demonstrating the JQ light. So this is definitely. Yeah, yeah. So if you did this again, I got the projects over here. So if I was to do, no problem. So if I was to go back to the HTML and just add another button, both of these, see how they both work together, and all I had to do was add that HTML because the attribute, because the directive is actually doing all of this and it's containing it to its own little scope. So let's come out of this and let's go with the actual. Let's go right to an element here. So Command Control F. It's the same size. This is really big. I don't know why. I guess that's because I made my appearance. Yeah. All right. Okay, so here we're assigning. Let me go back to full screen. Here we're assigning an element directive. It's the same directive. It's just now that we're declaring it as an element. And we're not going to worry about this class one. But if we were to make it, if we set the restrict property within the directive to use class, then we could just use it like this. So we have, all right, directive style element. So let's see if this works. For some reason, it just doesn't want to. Yeah, it's funny because all the other stuff is big. All right. So if we go back to our enter button directive, we want to add the restrict element item in because we're actually declaring it as an element. And let's go ahead and use a template URL. Here's actually an example. Gosh, I forgot. Keep on forgetting that you guys can't see way back there. If you can't see, please remind me. All right, so right here is actually the template property, and we can actually pass in the template we want to use for that property, or for the directive. And see how it's just doing the button danger. That's what makes the red in the background. But let's just go right to adding the template URL. Now this one's relative to this template. This
button.html is actually relative to my project. So when it goes and looks for this where this is at, then it will actually use the one where it finds it. So I wish I could just easily go back and forth here. See, now it's using the template URL, which is a different button type. And it's also using the element, since we listed it as an element, and we restricted it to use just the element. So, as you can see here, yeah. So we can actually list these out to like A, C, A, M, and this will actually, now this directive can be used on all elements, attributes, comments, and classes. Let's just stick to elements for now. Here, we'll go over some brief isolate scope stuff. This is what I was saying with the @ sign. As we can see, the enter button can be passed in as this @ sign, which means it's an attribute on the directive element. To show you what I mean, gosh, it's really weird why it's not letting me just. There's no like hotkey for it either. So. All right, so say we want to pass in something from the DOM. We want to pass it into to be used within our directive. Now that's where our isolate scope can come in handy, to where we can actually list a attribute on our what is this one? We can actually list an attribute on our element directive, and then this will then be passed to the directive. Can you guys see that? Sorry. No. It's really annoying. You see it okay? So this attribute will be passed into your directive because we're going to be declaring a isolate scope on this attribute. So just really quick here, this enter button will be the element directive that we have listed on our restrict. This enter button attribute will then be passed in via isolate scope, so it'll be made available on our directive. So if we were to go, God, where is it? Just trying to get back to WebStorm. It's like all over the place. And it keeps on closing my files. So see how this. See how this isolate scope. Oh, another way to define isolate scope is just creating a scope property and adding it as an object. So like if I wanted to add other attributes, since it's inside this object that's defined by these curly braces, I can just add in like clicks, or something like that. You can actually add in other attributes, which is really handy when you're trying to do when you have a lot of things that use the same scope. Like we have a modal window in one of our projects, and it keeps on getting created, and we don't want to keep on using the same parent scope or the same scope that all those directors are listening to. So we actually have to encapsulate the scope just to each single instance of that directive. But I'll show you just how to use this attribute very short. So this scope is now local to our directive. Gosh. And we'll pass it in here. So now what should happen is that since this is that button HTML or the template URL that I have, since it is using the Angular binding expression, since we're now passing in the enter button attribute, and it's on the scope, it should render this type as attribute or whatever's listed on our directives attribute or enter button attribute. Yeah, so yeah, it gets passed through, and then the type is actually attribute. So yeah, that, I don't know if that confused you more since I had to go back and forth with this full screen thing, but that is how in a nutshell how isolate scope works. You can just encapsulate your local scope even more so.
How limited is it? You put JavaScript now in there?
You mean in here?
No, yeah.
Oh, you mean actually in the HTML? So you're saying like right here, add. No, so this scope, since it's got the @ sign, it just takes the value, which is a string value. There are other things that you can do. You can, but like, I'll end up confusing people even more, which I'm pretty sure that I've confused everybody here. So that's just the attribute. There's also the equal sign and also the ampersand sign, and the equal sign will actually take your parent scope, so you can actually assign a scope function to it, and then you can actually have it in your isolate scope. The real main reason why you keep your isolate scope is because you don't want to include your parent scope, because it starts to, your parent scope or your directive scope of all your other directives start being confused with each other because they all use the same scope. So you're like I was saying earlier, the way that you communicate from one directive to the other is you share a scope, and when you do this, you're encapsulating that scope just to that one directive, and not to that one directive, one instance of that directive, because you can have multiple instances of that directive. So yeah. Another example, another thing is like in this little section we have the controller, and you can use the controller, but if you have an isolate scope, that overrides anything that you list in your controller. So if I was to enable this controller, everything that is in the controller as my $sign scope will be overridden by my isolate scope. Or not overridden, but just completely taken out. Like the scope will be replaced with non-$sign scope or isolate scope. All right, I've already gone over my time. All my slides are up on Prezi. I can put the link on the page, but I really a talk on directives, which is Angular's biggest piece, can take more. I mean, I have 42 slides here, but I need to leave time for other services. But just as a quick overview, if you're interested in learning about other things in here, these slides are actually a pretty good overview, and it goes into watches and how you can watch your NG models and have things happen when they change, and also I have a slight thing on advanced topics, being just cliff notes on broadcasts and emit and on, which are all Angular events, which are really handy. And I wish I could talk about them, but sorry. So I'll put the link for my Prezi presentation on the meetup website, and also I'll have the video too, and hopefully it helps anything. Some of the slides that came from, actually most of the slides, were from this really good talk by Christian Lilly, and it's if you go on Google and you just type Directives Part 2 Meetup talk, it does a lot of the same stuff that I was talking about today. And he's done his presentation a lot. Like, he goes places and does it, whereas this is the first time for me doing it. And I highly recommend it. Another great book, if you really want to learn Angular, is that Mastering Web Application Development with AngularJS. It talks a lot, really good about a lot of the stuff that I didn't get to cover. So there you go. Sweet. Services.
All right. Not going to be talking about that services. If not, we're going to set for that.
Did I? Talked about something here. I don't remember which one it was anymore.
I remember you mentioned Lodash, and I've been using that ever since.
Cool.
Over underscore.
Oh yes, it was. It was. Yeah. All right. Here we go. There's that.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, it's free if you want your top
All right.
public. It's free if you want your top public.
Hang out on
They have like all these.
Yeah, actually, we can. Send you an invite to from the one that you
Yeah,
Yes.
it's just talking so fast that I lost a lot of people. A lot of stuff to cover.
I'm going to not have it use my camera.
Yeah, we can share a desktop and the microphone's coming off.
Yep.
I really.
All right. Okay. Yeah, I get it. Right.
Click to give hands access. There you go.
No. Oh, there it is. Wow.
Yeah, give it access before you switch it back to
Okay.
agree and okay. And now join.
Oh.
And then up here, we're going to tell it to share your desktop. So one of these guys up there on the left, I don't remember which one it is. There you go. Pick a screen share, and then pick the one you want to share. And then it'll be your desktop or presentation window, whichever it is.
All right. Cool. Let's. All right. People listening? All right, are we ready to go?
I think. We'll continue on
Cool. All right. We're going to get started. I'm Jonathan Altman. I'm going to be speaking about AngularJS services this evening, what they are, why we use them, and a worked example of setting one up and having something hopefully semi-intelligent with it. Sir, everybody's in a lot of Chinese food last night, so this is going to be a great talk. That's my fortune.
Is that what it's meant to be? Or is that
Says I am. So you're in luck. Yeah, absolutely. So I thought that was auspicious. So anyway, what's a service? So I got the AngularJS definition of it. It's kind of dry and technical, which kind of describes a lot of the AngularJS documentation, which I think they've kind of acknowledged. So substitutable objects wired together using dependency injection. Use services to organize and share code across your app. They don't really explain how you do that or why you want to do that. We'll cover some of that. Lazily instantiated, not important singletons, kind of important to this. Part part of the dependency injections, it sticks the service at a place where various different artifacts inside your Angular application can get at them, and that's actually one of the important pieces of it.
So if you don't want to keep sliding up over USB Java,
well, let's just keep going to not mess stuff up. All right, so we're going to show you the very simplest sample service that there is. Get kind of uses use strict is not strictly necessary. I'm creating a module into which I want my service to live. Not strictly necessary. You can inject the service into your own Angular module that you've already got. I'm setting one out on my own. And then we just say on that module .service, you give it a name, and like a controller or anything else, the other things I want, other dependencies I want injected into the service, and constructor function, factory function that's going to fire it off for me. And there it is. I now have a service session manager that does absolutely nothing. But as the simplest example, neat thing is we now have access to root scope and resource. Those are things that frequently get used in various types of services. Root scope, as a general practice, and I'll cover why later, you, kind of, at least my current set of style guides says, you're always going to want root scope on there. We'll go over why. Resource is one of the things, or HTTP, if your service is going out and making service calls to back-end services that you might want access to it, but not necessary. So we're actually already familiar with a whole bunch of AngularJS services. Those are services. Scope, we all use that. Root scope, location, HTTP, resource, they're all services. Everybody familiar with the Angular sort of naming convention, things that come with Angular get a dollar in front of them. If it's not shipping with Angular, it doesn't. So that's one thing to remember as we build up services. So going back quickly to my sample service, mine was not named with a dollar on it. It's just called Session Manager. By the way, Session Manager is kind of the worked example I'm going to use. It's one of the first ones when building any enterprise application. Anything that has a login, pretty much, your Session Manager is kind of a really good use case for that. Okay, so let's use a service. So I have a controller, some control. It wants access to $scope, $HTTP. Nifty, and I forgot the important part of that. We're not actually using the service. Hang on just a second. We'll do a little bit of live coding. There we go. Fixed. So we now have a controller that can use $scope, $HTTP, and our Session Manager service, which isn't terribly useful yet, but we have access to it. All right, so that's good. That's very mechanical about what one is, how you use an Angular, but what is it really? Why do you actually want to use these things? What is it that we're doing with them? Okay, so we're going to pull some stuff out. The Angular documentation talked about a service is a singleton instance of an object. Okay, so it's an object. What's an object? Encapsulation of the state of a set of one or more properties, whatever they are. And that's not in the strict JavaScript or Java set of properties. There's a data value, and an object says, I'm going to wrap around this thing, and when you ask me to do something, or you ask, I'm going to do those things based on the value of the current value of those properties. You ask me to increment one of them, I'm going to increment it from whatever its current value is. You want me to query something against a database by the ID you stored in me, I'm going to do that. Whatever. So that's that's what we're using. We are leveraging the true meaning of what objects are supposed to be, which is a way to take a bunch of state, wrap it up, and say it's over here, and I can access things and do things based on what's in there. I can push things in, things can come out of it. So how does Angular use that? Well, so they use that encapsulation to provide ways for objects to communicate amongst themselves without having to have strict and pre-established relationships, and to not do things, as I mentioned in my anti-pattern, of grabbing my parent or going out to root scope, walking all up and down. It breaks dependency cycles, it breaks dependency trees. It provides a known location for you to go and say, I would like this information, or I want to put this information here. This is important for other pieces of me. And we'll go over places where that becomes important on a web application, but it allows you to cross-cut functionality without having to keep track of the exact layout of every scope that's inside your application. There we go. I muted myself. Okay. All right. So we've covered that. So some warnings. Some warnings and some guidance. Encapsulation does not mean persistence. Because it's an object and it's a service and you've instantiated it, it has state as long as it exists. If you hit F5, you get a new instance of your service class along with a new instance of every single scope. So to use our session manager there, if you get a session key from your server that you're supposed to hold on to, don't leave it in just a property of your session object, because F5 will kill it, and you probably want to keep it. But one of the nifty things is you can encapsulate state of things like local storage. So you can build a service that says, oh, I'm managing the session key that the server gave me that every AJAX request I need to make that I want session data from can do. I'm going to stick that. You give it to me, login control. I'm going to stick it in local storage for you. When somebody asks me for it, I'm going to go see if I have it already. If I don't have it, I'm going to go check in local storage, get the value. If it's not expired, I'm going to assume it's still good and hand it to you. If it's expired, I'm going to say, yeah, your session's probably dead. So that's an important little sharp edge to worry about, because you go, oh, great, I've got it in the object. I'm good. I don't ever have to worry about this again. Well, you do when you reload the page. You may not always be reloading the page, but it does happen. And you want to protect your users against, hey, I'm going to hit refresh. So that kind of covers what I want to go over at a high level. We're now actually just going to go through a worked example. It's a quick sample. I'll put these slides up after. They'll go up on slide decks. I'm still stuck on Keynote. But the plunker's out there as well. It works. We're going to go over it. So we will flip over to that. Okay. All right, so we're over there. There we go. Can everybody see the code, or should I make it a little bit bigger than it is? What's that? A little bigger? Okay, we can do that. Fortunately, we need that. This turned out, if for no other reason than this, to be a really good way to do this. That good?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know. What's that? There we go. Okay, now let's do wait one thing. I'm not going to leave this up here. There we go. Never mind. Oh. There we go. All right, I give up. I was able to de-HTML that stupid little bar away, but we're going to live with it. Okay, so here's our example. This is very trivial. It doesn't actually authenticate anywhere. There's not a web service behind there. It's a standalone clunker. But let's log in, which is pretty easy. You hit the button, you're logged in. And now I'm an authenticated user, and I've got a new menu item. So what we're going to show is the user services to handle authentication and managing what menus are supposed to be displayed there. Actually, we're using a directive to do part of our menus as well. We handle that, log in, log out, and I'm back to an authenticated user. So we're actually going to go through some of the code for this. So there's not a whole lot that's interesting in the HTML, but we'll go over what's there. I'm using Bootstrap. So the idea is that menu is using divs of class navbar default. The big thing on it is it has a controller, menu control. So that's going to be one of our important pieces. Menu control is handling the menu, is handling some of the state around what's in the menu. In there, one of the interesting parts, we have the directive product menu, which is actually something that I've created. So that's kind of it for the other one is on the login, logout button. There's an ng-click toggle login, and what it's supposed to say is based on something in the state of the menu control. So we're getting the login, logout function and what the menu is actually supposed to say out of the controller. So that covers that. Everything else is the interaction between controllers and our service. So we're going to go down. We're going to look at our service a little bit. So now we're going to expand. We had our empty declaration before. We created that. This was all here before. Now we're starting to get into what's some of my internal state. So I'm going to keep some user info, set of default menu items, which is what's going to happen. When I first come up and we don't know whether I'm logged in or not, I'd like to be able to display something to the user. I don't want to sit there and have nothing going on until we get to the point of things. So we're going to say, well, if I don't know what menu items you're supposed to have, you're going to get home and login. This is actually unused, and I can take out, but be that as it may, there's home. So I set my initial set of menu items to the default. I'm going to say that I'm unauthenticated and I'm not logged in. Until I check and get the information, I'm going to assume that I'm not logged in. Now we have some functions. Log user in. So when the user successfully logs in, ordinarily in a service, I might actually get this set of menu items from my server in response to authentication and the authorization process that goes on that. It may come in and say, here's your session, here's the username, and here's the set of menus that you can give this user versus that user. And I would pick them up at this point. In this case, I'm just saying I'm going to push in my Steal Secrets item. That's all I'm going to do. But in general, it might be something that came back from the server. And this is a model that I use in, I've actually got one live and one almost live application using a pattern very much like that. I'm not going to spend menu items right too much. I had been doing some stuff with login and logout being delivered over that. There are some things with directive scope that were biting me, so I yanked it all out. But not from the service, so we need that.
I got a question.
Yeah.
See, I've always created a service with the factory method, and I've always wondered what the semantics are, because I know it's just semantics on
creating with service and creating with dot factory?
Don't know the answer. I've done it both ways.
Yeah, it's like they work both ways. I don't know the difference.
Yeah, I really don't know the answer. A lot of what I do, I mean, it's also not necessary where I'm actually saying I want the service to live over in a separate module from everything else. It's not necessary for this kind of all-in-one example. I could just create one module and throw everything in there. It's kind of my style / hygiene practice to do that as much as I can. Some of my bigger projects I'm using require.js to get the minification and some other stuff out of it. And this makes it easier for me to break stuff up into multiple files that I can load separately.
What I'm saying is you can do the same thing with factory.
Yeah, and anything that returns.
The decomposition is good.
Yeah, yeah. You're just trying to get a function, get it to return a function that can be called to instantiate an object. I've been going on. Are there any other questions?
That was my question too. One difference I've seen between a service and a factory was that you return a giant object from the factory, right? As opposed to here, you just define a function that you're going to return from the service.
One use at this point is not. The difference is whole versus function. It's a style. The two paradigms JavaScript are functional is whole and that's like so Angular provide both, but the end becomes identity.
Yeah. Also, like I think I come from a Java background, so in Java we can use factors. There's a fact pattern. So I think Java developers use factors.
Yeah.
This is something very specific. I think.
Some of it may have to do with that. What is it exactly I'm returning, or how am I doing it? That in this case, I get to call a function if I have setup work for things that I may want to do up front. I get the opportunity to do that. So, all right. So we have log user in. So we had menu items. We set the username. And now we do two things. And remember I said the kind of hygiene good practice is to use root scope, and is to include root scope, and it's so that I get access to broadcast. And so this is one of the ideas of breaking some of the dependency cycles and not having to keep track. It avoids a circular dependency that my control says I need to inject this thing, and it needs to keep track of it and say, I'm going to ask you when things change, and I can only go to you to get that information. When you get a large enough architecture, multiple people working on it, maybe somebody changes who's responsible for saying the login status has changed. Well, if I say, well, I'm going to go to the session manager, or menu item's a better example. If the session manager is always going to be responsible for login status, it may not always be responsible for the menus. You may have a menu item service eventually anyway. But if somebody builds their controllers to say, I'm going to go to the session manager to get the menu items, and somebody says, well, I want to refactor this application to have a menu service, well, now you got to go find all the places that care about menu changes and go add a new dependency injection and do something with it. In this case, you don't have to do that. You just say, by broadcasting, you just throw an event out there. You all still have to agree what events are going to be broadcast. But once you decided, it doesn't matter who broadcasts it anymore. You can refactor that out to anything you want to. You don't have to keep track of all the dependencies. You just have somebody say, I'm going to take responsibility for this, or multiple places could be responsible for it, and say, I'm going to ship out a menu change event. So broadcast out your event changes, and then anybody who wants to listen without having to cooperate can just say, I'm going to listen in on this and do something intelligent. So in response to a login and logout, we broadcast the menu change, login status change, and we pass along the menu items, username. There's some other stuff out there. There's username and are they logged in was the other one I was throwing out there. Then we expose a few things that can be called from the outside. These are ways to push state changes in. I'm actually cheating. and I'll show you why I said you always want to broadcast out. You don't want people going in and querying. There are some initialization cases where some things may want to be able to do that. And here's a case where we can actually flip the login state. So this is a way where I can push state into things. So there's my service. It handles am I logged in, logged out, and what menus am I supposed to have. So let's go up and see how it actually might get used a little bit. So we're going to go up to, it gets used in a couple of places, and this is where we're going to show where it looks like we're cheating a little bit and where we're not. Actually, we cheat in both places, but we'll show you the use of it. So one is when we log in and log out. When we log in, remember the login and log out is part of the menu controller, and it's communicating with the session manager directly. But we also have this over here changing depending on your login state. That's not in the scope of the menu controller. It's outside the scope. It's under main control, which has some bad nesting and is actually an outer scope. But I could change that. I could make it a nice separate area. But they're now communicating because the main control receives login status change messages and sets scope.name, which if you look at the template, there's a double mustache username right there being output. When login status changes, I grab the username out of that state change message and update myself. The cheat, as I said, is when I first initialize, and there may be a more angular way to do this with events than what I'm doing, like throwing out, actually, the obvious one would be that the session manager throws out an initialization message. The second is created saying, here's what I am. But we actually go in and say, well, I'm initializing, just go get me the username. That's my cheat. Then we do similar things on menu control. I get my current menu items. I'm going to say that logged in is false, but again, I could ask for session manager or username and do some other stuff. But I'm assuming I'm logged out, and I set my message to log in or log out depending on whether I'm logged in or out. Menu changed when the event comes in. I grab the menu items off of that event, set it to my scope variable. That updates whether I see steal secrets or not.
A question.
Yeah.
Persistence?
Yeah.
Is there a way to make a service, let's say we're in this session right now, and the client wants to save the browser session to client's OS? Go down the client from the session? This might be really simple.
So there are a number of ways with HTML5 that you can get access to browser persistence.
Angular is a little bit easier?
Not in and of itself. So when I've done it and I've needed to do it, for the set of browsers that I need to worry about, local storage is available to me and I can live within its constraints. So local storage is really easy to grab onto and do what I need to do.
So yes?
So yes, absolutely. And services are a place to do that, to say I want to have a mechanism where I'm going to persist out some data. That's a really great place to build a service around that. So that you don't have individual, again, it's an access control mechanism. There's a central point managing a particular part of local storage for me. Make that a service, give it well-known operations for how it's going to go do that, rather than saying, well, we're all going to agree how we're using local storage. Well, no, don't do that. Have one central place that says, here's how we're going to use local storage, and everybody else follows it. So on my controller, I have toggle login, which again doesn't do much other than turn around and call session manager or toggle login. And again, I'm watching login status changed. Just looking for events. And that's how we wire up that I can log in, log out, have my stuff change. Make sure I have anything there. That's it. Pretty much it. The directive part's not really relevant to the service implementation here. It's just a convenient way for me to get my menus done. It was something I just pick up from a different project. So that's kind of it for the worked example. I have a thing.
Now, when you broadcast off the root scope, I know all the child scopes can listen on it. And since you're broadcasting from the parent scope or the however many scopes, let's consider like best practice for when you want to, because I thought it was always like considered dirty to involve your root scope in the broadcast, and you could just like admit it up a couple, up or down, depending on where you are at in your scope.
But you were in a service.
Yeah, but your controller, wasn't your controller using broadcast?
That might be bad hygiene. I have not looked at it. I don't. Generally, I'm not doing broadcasts out of my controllers. I mean, one of them is I would say that's probably an anti-pattern. If you're broadcasting out of controllers, you might be doing something wrong. You probably want to have a service that you're telling and let the service broadcast it out.
Yeah, because like when I create directives, I usually just use broadcast, but I'm either admitting it from my scope, or not the root scope, unless I need to go across a bunch of stuff into another. Like if I have to go up to the root scope and then down to another parent scope, that's when I would just call root scope and say broadcast it across all scopes.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's the point is to get to broadcast however you can. I just want everybody who might be listening in to see this.
Okay.
So
is there any reason why you wouldn't use root scope for broadcasting?
I don't know of any. I mean, that's just my default behavior is get root scope to broadcast. I won't use root scope for anything else. But the idea is, okay, and even if I had a controller where I said, okay, well, I don't want to build a service for this, I would inject root scope so I would get its broadcast. And that gets out of the partitioning, because otherwise what's going to happen is, you know, like I said with services, I don't want to go up 3 levels and then do that and say, oh, well, I didn't, you know, I just changed my directive, and now instead of creating a child, you know, not creating a child scope, I'm creating a child scope, and now I'm only, you know, I needed to go up n+1 levels to do my broadcast, and now it's not being seen properly. Yeah. I'd be more likely, if I was concerned about
I guess maybe you broadcast on things that you don't want everybody to listen to, if you were broadcasting from non-root scope.
Yeah, but again, as I said, that gets really sticky. Because if I say, oh, I'm going to go up 3 levels, and now I change something about my directive design so that I'm forcing child scopes to be created.
Well, I guess a better thing would be like if you only wanted the child scopes of that controller to listen to it, and not any scopes above it, you could use that emit, I guess, that goes downward, or no, emit goes upwards, broadcast goes downward. So you could use broadcast if you only wanted to broadcast from like your scope down rather than root scope down.
Yes, but if you're 4 levels down and you want to do it, you know, if you say I've got like there's a big tree here, I'm going to take this chunk of it, and I want to broadcast below here.
Yeah.
Okay, well now you need to keep track of that scope for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess.
Which means you now need to pass that around, and that starts. It starts looking like an anti-pattern at some point. It may not be, but if you do, then what would happen is, like if I have a bunch of directives that are off doing that, I would start at the kind of top level directive and say, I'm going to pass this instance of this thing explicitly down to everybody, but then everybody who, you know, everything that's used underneath that needs to remember to pass it along if it may have to broadcast on it. and that's what gets screwy. I know there are issues of broadcast gets very broad because it may be going to a lot of scopes that don't want to see it. My inclination would be I might do really cheeseball stuff like name my events like, area.area.event thing, just
try to get specific as you can. Like it's coming from this area and it's under this directive.
I think that's kind of overkill. I think I'd treat it more like namespaces, but try not to get too deep. But there's really a smell test going on there other than performance reasons. And I would think about what I was doing in that case. Because otherwise, you can broadcast it, and only the listeners are going to do anything with it. It's not like everybody has to see it. It's, when I say on, I'm going to go say I want to, I'm going to register for this thing. So.
Went to a similar debate recently. Actually, I was actually the key conclusion is similar to you. Actually, you let when you go, one direction, broadcast in the other direction. Because otherwise you get the global variable view. Yeah. It gets dirty. Like, how do you find the heat names when you have to? It's no right or wrong. It's subjective.
Yeah, I guess if you have like 2 developers and you called it like you called your broadcast like blah, and your other developer called it blah, and next thing you know you have 2 listeners that are listening on this.
Yeah, I have a good example of that. I think it's pretty simple. When I was at a guard meeting up in Boston last fall. You guys know what an guard is?
The guard's info.
It's a public-private partnership with FBI and businesses to help protect the critical infrastructure of the nation. Anyway, there was somebody there who mentioned injecting code, and they're now injecting code into pages. People thought they're just cyber criminals. Here we are talking about injecting code into pages. It's an anti-pattern where somebody's using the same word for 2 different things. One's negative, one's a positive. So yin and yang, I guess. But yeah, I guess we should be talking to the FBI as well. This looks good to me.
I guess in root scope, right? You should the good practice is to keep those information that is used throughout the site. Like for example, you authenticate a user, right? And then you have the user information like user ID and stuff like that, which can be used by other scopes.
Well, I think that's what you do.
No, that's actually the anti-pattern. Yeah. Don't cram that stuff into root scope. It is not a global dumping area. That's exactly what services are trying to avoid. Don't treat $root scope as, oh, this is the place where I can share state amongst a bunch of things. If you have a bunch of state, make a service, encapsulate it in that service, have that service be responsible for that thing or that small set of things. So my example was I have a session manager that's managing your login state, your username, and your menus. Make it responsible for that. Through dependency injection, things that need to see it will be able to see it. Things that don't care about it or don't need it won't have access to it, but it gives you control of the access, control over what you're exposing so that you don't have to, have this global stomping issue. So,
what's Gravatar?
It's like your picture for use over everywhere. It's a Gravatar. It's like a picture that you assign to an email address.
It's like your personal icon.
Oh, yeah. Avatar, but Gravatar.
Yeah.
Is it the anti-pattern?
Personal icons.
I don't know. It wasn't something I did. So I've covered most of this, so I don't need to repeat what I said. I mean, those are kind of takeaways from the example of kind of what my practice and hygiene is. I will, I will say the AngularJS devs and gurus may have moved on from some of this, but it's working for me. I pulled it out of the state of the art when I was looking at this back in January. So.
Yeah, I'd say another key thing is that singletons. Every service is a singleton. So like it shares its state, or it keeps its state amongst all services, right? Or not all services, all controllers that use that service.
Yes, I mean that. So that's the. I mean that is the point of it. Is there? You know, it is. If you look at it, at some point, it's little more than an inter-process communication mechanism. It's a way to say, I want to put this here so other objects that need to get access to these values can get access to them without us having to agree on how we can reach each other. I'm just going to have this well-known place where I can drop stuff. I'm going to put it in this mail slot, and that mail, you know, other places can either then ask that mail slot for it, or even better, when I put it in the mail slot's going to say, hey, anybody who cares about this, something happened to it. You know, this thing that you care about just happened. And here's either come ask me about it, and here's the payload of what it is that you're going to care about that you should, you know, that you should now act upon. So that's no, I did cover that. Yeah, put the state change that your data listeners care about into the payload of the thing that you broadcast. So if I want to say menus change, I just say menus changed, which means everybody's now going to go get me the set of things that have changed. Or you can just say, hey, menus changed, here's the new set.
Can you have a service within a service? Like, say you have a service that has a root scope and it broadcasts a service that goes out and grabs, goes and hits a REST URL and grabs a bunch of information, and then passes that along within the broadcast.
I don't, I mean, so once you load a service, I mean, basically what you're doing is you're saying this singleton object has a name that other people can DI. So you can't stop other people from doing it. Can you have a service use other services? Absolutely. I mean, when you say I want to use $resource or $root scope, you're grabbing onto it. So.
Is AngularJS seamless with HTML5?
Yeah.
And Canvas how long? It is.
Yeah, in HTML5.
Yeah, I mean there.
Is Canvas not in HTML5?
Angular runs within HTML5. So
I mean, it's orthogonal. You know, Angular is JavaScript. So
it is. Yeah, it's written well.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen some minor examples where they're actually doing stuff with like SVG and Angular, like they'll throw up a bunch of polygons using ng-repeat. So.
General comment or general thing about it, if you're towards the end. Here's a general statement, and this is something I think that I'm interested in everybody's opinion on. That is some of the things that you described, particularly where it's team coordination, for example, how we're going to manage broadcasts, or how we're going to emit, for example. That works perfectly. You got yourself a small team, everybody understands, everybody's coding just fine. You're done, you sell off the system, somebody buys it, for example, 6 months later they want to outsource it for maintenance. How does that other team know the way that you did these things? Meaning, consider aspects of documentation, design, etc., and conveying that to somebody else, because it's going to sound perfect while you're doing it. You're tight with it. Everybody knows what's going on. 6 months from now, you're maintaining it. Somebody else is maintaining it. How are they going to know what you did? How are they going to know what kind of agreements were in place? Code inspection
aspect.
What's that? Code inspection.
Well,
okay, but again, I mean that there's inspection from the perspective of quality, and then there's inspection from the perspective of picking it up later on. So so
that's actually one of the advantages of using broadcast, which is you can't really. I mean, you could wrap broadcast and do some really awful stuff and say I'm going to create a function that wraps broadcast, but the fact is you can correct your source code for broadcast. Whereas if you're just having, if you're using the kind of service call stuff, like the fact that you say, I'll get back over here, if I can, go. Come on. There we go. The fact that I injected scope up here as $scope, I could rename that there if I wanted to. I could be really evil. So, trying to look for, am I calling session manager.menu items? Well, I could just mess that up by saying, well, okay, you correct for session manager.menu items. I'm just not going to call it session manager there. I'm going to call it foo because I feel like being difficult. So that's a case where going with broadcasts, I think, you just grep all the broadcasts and see, here are all the events I can fire. Go look for all the $ons and say, who's responding for everything.
There's a point you make right then that I think is kind of an interesting one from traditional things in the past. You don't necessarily, people literally are examining the code to figure out what it's doing as opposed to finding out any sort of design or overarching architecture or anything along that line. Meaning that it's something to always consider in terms of if you're going to pick something up later on, how are you going to pick it up? What's going to be involved in it? And I guess the reason I keep coming back to this is when I think of things like Java over a very long period of time, how it's evolved, particularly from the perspective of IDEs and built-in abilities that facilitate your adding documentation. And documentation, not just documentation, but description of what you intend to do. What am I trying to do here, as opposed to somebody having to start to figure it out. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how JavaScript becomes maintainable, or whether it is or not, large-scale systems over a long period of time, and whether IDEs begin to take.
I mean, they already, to some extent, have. I actually use full IntelliJ IDEA because I work in other things besides just JavaScript. But I mean, so I have the WebStorm piece of IntelliJ there. It can already handle when you've got a project set up with Angular and WebStorm stuff on it. When you're writing JavaScript code, it knows about the Angular directives you created. So when you start trying to like I've got my modules in there like sample app.directives. It's actually smart enough to start doing auto-completes on that. So I think one of the ones in terms of that, being able to look at a code base and do it. So that's where I have with those namespaces and using .service versus .factory, where if you pick some not outrageous hygiene, I mean, you don't have to go nuts with it, but if you pick some nice, simple, not crazy coding conventions for AngularJS, I think it modularizes pretty well. And I've had to break up some stuff that I originally did monolithically. But once you get into how am I going to break this into files and split it up, it works fairly well. And when you look at the code, it's very, you can look at it an AngularJS file, and if you've done stuff like up here, so this is where I don't really love the app.controller model. When you get down here, you have, okay, I'm adding inside the sample app.directives, I'm creating a new directive. Okay, well, the sample app.directives module is where I put all my directives. Sample app.templates is where I'm going to put my templates. It I think makes it a little bit easier to say, okay, that here's where stuff lives. Here's how you go find it.
I have a question. Do you have a solution for disaster? Because we already actually written the same problem. The oldest Angular app we've written so far is less than 1 year old. And we already seen this issue because our team is developer. Yep. And we are already seeing broadcast events being completely adopted. So, I mean, we don't have a solution today. Do you have one?
No, we don't actually, and it's a thing that I'm keenly interested in because having been on projects both from the inception and then from having to pick up from the perspective down the line, I've seen horror stories, and horror stories not the word as much as great expense into something that really did not have to be that way. And I think one of the key elements to it is I've used the term documentation, which people frequently kind of look askance at. But I think one of the key things is to put what something intends to do, not how it's doing it in code, meaning some sort of architectural information that says, here's how this works, or here's what I was trying to do, not at the detailed code level of line by line, saying add 3 to 4 or something like that, but instead what the intent of it is. And I think the thing that you have to really be careful about is that without that kind of overview of it, for example, I kind of come from a C background for a very long time. nothing irritated me more than to open up a source file and the first line be pound include. That irritated the crap out of me. I mean, because now it meant I had to spend labor time to read the code, figure out what the code was trying to do, when the person that wrote the first place could have put something at the front and says, here's what this does, or here's why this exists, or whatever. And I was always fascinated by that aspect of somebody not thinking about the next person who's going to have to pick it up. And that next person could be somebody sitting next to you that you pass information over to, or it could be somebody on the other side of the world that you're trying to have maintained over 6 months or a year later. And you said exactly the concern that I've been seeing, and I've seen a lot with Angular, with JavaScript, and Node and JavaScript in general. And that is, you can hack it together real fast. We can get this thing going, and we can have it out the door, agile, tomorrow, Friday, whatever. Phew! And the future is an SEP, somebody else's problem. And that somebody else's problem is the person who's responsible for that down the line. And it's astounding how a surprisingly little bit of paragraph will get somebody headed in the right direction, so they're not having to look at it line by line by line by line by line.
Angular is particularly wonderful, even compared to Node, because things like Directive, they talk to Directive, they talk to controller, they talk to services. It's like a freeway relationship.
Yep.
So it's like, how do you document that? I can make anything document anything with this one line. I can change it from the state machine anytime I want. Just hack it. And like, we don't even know how to document things.
Correct. And I do not have a good answer for that, because I've seen way too excessive documentation that laid on the table for years and cost a fortune to write, never got looked at once. And I've seen pound include at the start of a source file, and there's somewhere in between. There is a correct level of thinking of the long term.
But even when you write documentation, it's only good if when the code changes, the documentation changes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because the worst is you don't have the pound include at the top of the file. You have a big long document that explains what it does, and it doesn't actually match the artifact.
Correct. Oh, and that goes back to the inspections comment, and that is, code's done. Somebody looks at it and says, does something say what this code does? Whether it's a picture, a line drawing showing who's talking to what, and just to some degree. But then changes are made. Let's make sure that somebody checks to make sure that any descriptive material evolved to match those changes, or that there's something in the IDE that shows these interfaces that are occurring, because what will invariably cost you a fortune are interfaces. When an interface changes, just a surprising amount of mess appears on the floor, particularly if you don't have automated testing that verifies everything's still working, it breaks something that was working once, because that's another key element. You don't necessarily, depending on the level of documentation you have or useful information, you also need to have something that gives a developer confidence that he just shouldn't mess something up. That if you don't have built-in tests or automated tests or some sort of test facility sitting out there that I'm going to go in and change one line of code, hit this button, and I want to be confident I didn't make it worse than it was. And hopefully I made it a little bit better in some fashion by adding a feature or whatever, but it still does what it was supposed to do. So, and that's a challenging area, because it's not unusual to not budget building in testing of some sort. And generally, if you don't do that from day one, it's not ever going to happen correctly. So going back to your point, is the first thing a developer needs is confidence that he didn't break something when he modified something he didn't write in the first place, or that he wrote 6 months ago and doesn't remember what in the world this thing does. So that would be my good answer to it, I'm afraid.
Can you pound include, I know you include header files with pound include. Can you pound include comments?
Absolutely, you could. You can, in fact.
Yeah. All right.
Have you looked at the Angular unit testing for that documentation, or the ability to document your work?
We actually experimented a little bit with that with our project last year, or whenever it was that we did it. And I think that those things work well, but you got to know how to do it. And that's the other difficult part about this. It's really easy to go into JavaScript and start doing stuff in a hurry and not know about these other things or how to do them in a way that is useful or effective, and instead just focus on code. So I think the answer is yes, it can be done, but the team needs to know how to do it. And it isn't always something to pick up in a few minutes.
Right. But I think that's orthogonal to the issue of it being JavaScript. I think.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's one of the ones like, Agile does not mean there is no documentation. I think the original Agile guys, I think Ward Cunningham, would probably be pretty clear that Agile does not mean no documentation. if you get a project done quickly with no documentation, that does not mean you did it. That actually means, in fact, you did not do it in an agile fashion. So, there's nothing inherent to JavaScript. You can write perfectly undocumented C just as well as you can write undocumented JavaScript. I think it's more a comment about who are the teams you are hiring to do X and at what speed. Do they do it and at what level of completeness / professionalism / whatever axis you want to describe the documentability of their artifacts. And that gets hard. You can write great code in any language, but you can write really lousy code in any language too. I think it's more getting at the mindset of, well, people who work on this stack tend to write better documentation, but that may be more cultural / practice of the team, of organizations that choose to use those stacks for those purposes.
It's just an area that I think will continue to come up, and the reason is there's so many things rapidly being evolved or turned into nodes, specifically just from a performance perspective. But I think not having the years of tooling in place behind it means that you're not necessarily going to take advantage or build in some of these facilities that have existed in the past and may not really exist. So, again, I don't have a pat answer by any means.
But if Google is working with this and they're the front line, are they going to try to troubleshoot this?
How do you mean?
Google has a lot of people who are inventing things are from Google.
Yeah.
Are they not aware of these things? Are they going to
Sure, they're interested in features. I mean, back to the Agile. One of the aspects of Agile is give me features. Give me a feature this week or you're fired. Or I want a feature in here that's 2 weeks at most. I want those features in, and I want to see those features. But nowhere did it say, for instance, I'm going to sit down and look at what you write to describe those features and how you did it. And I think that the focus of nowadays is rapid turnover. So Google is looking to add features. They're trying to add them just as fast as
they have their own testing. And Jasmine, that's big.
Yeah, I agree.
Altman does a really good job with the dependency injection. Protractor does some of that.
Angular mock backend.
I'm not sure if that helps you test broadcast.
I just picked broadcast as an example. I mean,
I think that's particularly the hardest thing.
Yeah. I mean, you could have maybe like a broadcast event within a test that tests what it's broadcasting.
You can broadcast.
Yeah.
I mean, and something I'm always interested in is hostile testing, meaning I'm going to take this on code in here, I'm going to beat it silly by doing things that somebody never anticipated. And I have such a vivid memory of something ages ago, and that was a testing person, a really expert guy. Rich had written a bunch of bug reports, the software leads, made sure all those bug reports were fixed. And she said, this is ready to go. And he walked up to the workstation, he flattened his hand out, and he pushed his hand on the keys all at once, and it crashed. And she said, you can't do that. And he said, I just did. So, I mean, that's an example of hostile testing. So by that, what I mean is, you got a code sitting in a white box type test situation, throw events at it, do whatever, which may not make any sense. But I'm using that as an example of stringent testing. Now, it doesn't make sense to do that in everything. I'm more interested, I think, in some descriptive material and a way to know I didn't make it worse. When I touched one line in it, that one line may have been some weird freaking thing inside of it, completely innocuous that caused a problem way down here that won't be obvious until 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday in production when everything goes to pieces and I get a phone call. Or, yeah, right. So anyway, that's kind of my point. Yeah.
Both we talked a lot about the scope today. Do either the speakers have? Is it inherently anti-pattern? If my pattern is like 10 levels deep.
No, I have actually a page that we have like 14 modal windows,
okay,
and they all use their own scope. And I have my batarang is like I have to like do that with my mouse. It just goes all the way down to the bottom. I mean,
right.
As long as your scopes, as long as you're not intertwined and they're doing stuff to other things and other things are having effect with them, you can have as many scopes as you want.
I have a similar one. It's not modal dialogues, but it's a very large table that can have templates for individual cells, and so I can have each row has a scope, each cell has a scope, each cell that uses a template has another scope, and I think even within the template, there are yet more of them. So not only do I have a lot of them, it's a fairly deep tree as well. So
yeah, I was just going to say, I just learned of Angular a week ago from Chris. And all I can say is it looks like a really concise, clean, compact way of sailing through big data applications, whatever they are. I think Angular started in 2009. Is that when they
4 years ago?
Is that 2005? The data trended on Google Trends 2011 this way.
Exponential.
So, yeah, it looks really great.
Yeah.
I'm just an optimist.
Well, if anybody's got any big questions, seeing out otherwise, I think we're about done for that. I think that these were excellent subjects. I think directives is one of those areas that has a ton of power when you see different ways it can be made use of, and I think services are another area of that. And we very much appreciate Chris and Jonathan doing this for us, because these are not trivial subjects. They're not things that you're going to pick up in a few minutes. And you're going to tend to need to look at working examples that you can tweak and see what they do. And one of the nice things about Angular is it's so darn visual. I mean, that you can fiddle with it, over here something changed, and give you some confidence that you know what it did, why it did it, maybe how it did it, or just hope you know how it did it. That's
it's actually one thing I would say about services, which I didn't include in the presentation, but it's true, which is until I wrap my head around the fact that I needed to write more services and more directives to do things, Angular was fairly hard. The little light that went on that said, oh, this needs to just be wrapped in a service, make more services. Oh, this is really complicated data I need to lay out. Maybe you should, don't do this all in a template with one scope. Make it a family of directives. Life got a lot easier.
I mean, the analogy to that from way back when is one big old long function that did everything. It had a main and an exit, and then everything in between. So, view directives is an example of pieces of
and maybe we'll have like a part due of the directives, because I only got through half of it. It's that.
Do you think controllers are overused?
I think if they're used in the right manner, then they can. I mean, controllers are controllers. You need them to bound to the scope of the HTML, the main HTML DOM, right?
Yeah, bound scope and put data at the appropriate level. In terms of what their operations are, I think a lot of times they break down to be fairly simple operations that probably interact with services quite a bit.
All right, well, we appreciate it. For suggestions people have for future topics, let us know. If you want to present on anything ranging from detailed code to high level, make a picture of how the code works, let me know, and we will fit it in the schedule. In my desk.